I think we'll get started. Good morning, and this is the second lecture on networks and markets. So, as I mentioned yesterday, the theme of the lecture today is going to be on the boundaries, if you like, between social networks and anonymous markets. And so I think there are different ways of thinking about this, and as we go into the material and as we go through some models, you will see that it's sort of a good idea to bear in mind that these are abstract notions, social personalized exchange and anonymous markets. These are sort of abstract concepts, and in the lecture yesterday, Matt Elliott, for instance, spoke about markets that are themselves networks. So there's a sense in which one has to always be careful about taking these things too literally. But having said that, I think it's still a useful. I think it's a useful conceptual distinction, and I'll explore that in the lecture today. And in particular, I'm going to talk about a number of ideas which have to do broadly with, you may think of it broadly as the Great Transformation idea, the Great Transformation hypothesis, which says that with industrialization, with capitalism, you have somehow traditional society which was based largely on family and kin-based economic exchange. You could think of it as based on reciprocal exchange. That recedes, and in its place we have more long-distance, arm's-length, anonymous exchange, which is mediated through formal contracts. There are more developed law enforcement institutions, and we have a much more powerful and much larger state, the executive part of the state. So that's sort of the space in which we want to look at issues about how social networks might be related to markets and indeed to the state. Okay, and so what I will be doing in the first part, in fact, most of the lecture today will be looking at networks and markets. But towards the end, if we have time, I'll talk a bit about how one needs to bring in the state because of the very, the arguments I was just making about the Great Transformation, the role of the state, and formal legal enforcement institutions are very important. And I'll make some remarks on the nature of the state. But that depends a bit on how far we get. Okay. So the Karl Polanyi, this expression, the Great Transformation, it actually goes back a long way. Certainly, I've given some quotations here, but there was a lot of interest in the 18th century already in this idea of what's going to happen to reciprocity and what's going to happen to human nature with the growth of trade and commerce. And so there were many writers who were commenting on that. And I've just picked one quote, but it's representative. So this is the school which thinks that commerce, capitalism, expansion of economic activity is good for, if you like, human nature, because it makes people more trusting and it makes people more farsighted. So they take a longer view of their interests and they act and they think more in terms of a repeated game and so on. And then there is a more recent, this is very well-known, which was very well-known in the for a while, this book by Fred Hirsch, which is going the other way, that you can read this, but basically markets and capitalist values are eroding, eroding morality and so forth. So there's been a...
Isn't that proposition of Hirsch already in the Communist Manifesto? talk about drowning the values in the icy waters of calculation. I don't really
Probably. Some of this has resurfaced in a more recent book by Michael Sandel, the What Money Cannot Buy, the Moral Limits of Markets. So I could have given a quote from a 2011 book by Michael Sandel. So I think I just wanted to place this in context, and today, and I imagine the lectures on development and networks that Esther will be giving may also have something to do with this. There is a poster which is which is a very nice empirical study on how markets and networks interact, which you should certainly see. I saw it yesterday. So it's a very so here's the argument, and Sandel's book, which is I recommend it. It's very very readable, full of many sort of very nice empirical illustrations. Lot of so it's very, very definitely worth reading. The point is that he's trying to develop is that markets crowd out social ties and aggravate inequality, whereas there are others, and I gave you some quotes, where people think that actually it goes the other way. And so what we are going to do, one of the aims of the lecture today is to try and think through these arguments using formal models. So I'm going to start by talking about a very elegant early paper by Rachel Cranton in the AER. This is a paper which basically has, so I'm going to go through the model at a fairly abstract, fairly high level, so I won't do a lot of won't develop the model formally. But the idea here is that you have the possibility, there's a large set of people, and they can either engage in reciprocal exchange, which is that they can get into a bilateral relationship, which is long-lasting, or they can go to the market, which is anonymous, and when they go to the market, depending on how thick the market is, they can easily find someone, or it may take them a while to find someone. There are search frictions, if you like. So you see here a very nice setting where the advantage of being in a reciprocal relationship is that the person is always there for you. If you want something, he will give it to you. The downside is that he may not provide you what you really want, because he will provide you whatever he can do, which may not be matching perfectly with what you want. When you go to the market, you will get what you're more likely to get what you want, but there's a search friction. So those are the two. The economics of that has to do. And then if you are in one setting, if you are in reciprocal exchange, you're not in the market. That's the way the model is set up. So the two are, by construction, competing, essentially. And if you have a lot of people in the market, then the reciprocal exchange is sort of drying up. And if you have people in reciprocal exchange, then the market is very thin. Okay. So that's the broad setting. So how does one think about reciprocal exchange? When the question is, when do you expect reciprocal exchange to be sustained, and when will it erode, and will it be replaced by the market? And so the way the reciprocal exchange works is it's like a favor exchange mechanism. So today I come to you and say, I need something, and could you do me a favor? And the idea is that you do me a favor and you incur a cost. You do the favor to me because if in future I would then do you a favor. Okay, so this is that's the way the model works. Now, of course, you do me a favor, but I might renege. I might run away. Okay, if I run away in next period, if you ask me for a favor and I run away, what can you do? Well, you can punish me. You can ostracize me, which means I'll have to go off to the market. So that's my outside option. Okay. And so it's going to be important how large the market is. If the market is very large and diverse, then of course I don't have to worry. If I renege on you, I have this very attractive outside opportunity. But if the market is very thin, then I might think twice before reneging on my promise to you. Okay, so that's sort of the basic idea. And so now you see that the two are sort of substitutes, and you can see this basic trade-off. The more people engage in reciprocal exchange, the less they need to rely on markets to obtain goods and services, and vice versa. Okay. So what is the main insight of the paper? That reciprocal exchange and markets actually by construction are substitutes, and the second sort of insight is that they are self-sustaining. Once you have a very large traditional economy, people will just remain in that economy because it's just not attractive to join the market. If, on the other hand, there's a shock to the system for a variety of different reasons, and the market really grows, then people will start moving out of reciprocal exchange, and the market will take over. Okay. So that raises the question about welfare. Is it the case that markets will always replace traditional exchange when they are efficient, and vice versa? And as you can see, because of the market thickness pressure, you can get inefficient outcomes very, very naturally in this model. Right? So if most people are in reciprocal exchange, even if the market actually offers a better option, people will still remain in reciprocal exchange. So how do you measure welfare? So the key costs of doing reciprocal exchange is that I may not get the goods that I really want. Okay, so if it is the case that all goods are very substitutable, they're very close substitutes, then of course there is no cost to my being in a relationship with you, because I get more or less what I want every time I get a favor from you. Okay. On the other hand, if goods are very poor substitutes, then it's costly for me to be in a reciprocal exchange with you. I'd rather be in the market where I get what I really want. Okay. So that's the way the welfare analysis is done. There is no production in this model. Yes. So you see that if commodities are close substitutes, then reciprocal exchange is efficient. If they are poor substitutes, then markets are efficient. But in the equilibrium, you can have, depending on where you start, in a sense, you can have path dependence, and you can get either of the two emerging as the markets or exchange as emerging as the dominant, or they can take over, if you like, and that depends, if you like, on where you start. Okay. Yes?
There are also search costs in the market. The markets on the internet is very fast, but I don't need any relationships.
Yes, I was going to come to the internet later in the talk today. So I because of course you're right. If you take the model literally, yes, you will expect that social exchange should be seriously compromised with this, if you like, fall in search costs on the internet. But there are other things the internet does which actually greatly strengthen social networks. So I was going to come to that later. But, yeah. So that was the very sort of nice, and I think a very nice way of thinking about these trade-offs between reciprocal exchange and anonymous markets. So what I want to do now is to make a couple of remarks on this model. So first of all, there is the way the model is set up, there is actually very little heterogeneity between individuals in this model. Everyone is pretty much the same, and a major concern in the literature, on the interaction between markets and networks, has always been the implications for inequality. So that's hard to study in this very, in this model. The other big sort of point that I think it's worth bearing in mind is that there are many empirical studies which actually show that markets reinforce networks, and moreover, people who are very well connected actually gain a lot from markets. So there's a sense in which this model by construction rules out those sorts of settings where markets and networks can coexist and in fact reinforce each other. Okay, so what I want to do is to start by talking about two empirical studies and which draw attention to how markets and networks interact, and also draw attention to who participates in markets when markets arise. By who I mean, who are the people in a traditional society, traditional social network, who are going to participate in markets, and what are the implications for inequality. Okay, so this is a very nice empirical paper by Munshi and Mark Rosenzweig in the AER. And what it does is it looks at the Indian city of Mumbai or Bombay, and it's been changing. The name has changed in the meanwhile. So it's the commercial capital of India, and in the 1990s, the Indian economy was liberalized, and so what that means for the purposes of this empirical study is that white-collar jobs in service industries became much more attractive. Okay, which means that it became more attractive to train to take up a white-collar job. That means, in the context of the study, that English language schooling became more attractive as compared to the local language, which is Marathi, which is the language of the region. So the study looks at what did parents decide to do with their children. Did they put them in the local language school? Did they put them in the English language school? And the main finding of the paper is, so the trade-off here is that if you go to the local language school, you're going to be more naturally going into semi-skilled jobs, manufacturing jobs, which are networked. These are labor markets which are networked in the sense that you get jobs through contacts. But if you go to the white-collar jobs in the service sector, the social networks are not so well developed. It's a more closer to the classical sort of anonymous market. So social networks don't matter very much. So really, a key consideration here is that if you stick to local language schooling, you may be able to use the local networks that are around, community networks. If you go to English language schooling, you won't be able to use the networks; they are not there. So what happens over this period in the 90s is that parents who had so there were two levels of sort of findings. One major finding is that parents sent girls much more to English language schools. The reason is that girls were not embedded in most of the networks were basically male dominated. And so if you were to go to a local language school, you would not be able to use those networks to get jobs. So that's one sort of level finding, that girls were much more sent to English language schooling. The other major finding is that because so bear in mind that the reason you want to go to a local language school, one advantage of that is that you can use social networks. So the size of the social network is going to matter. So that's a key variable in this analysis. So if you are in a community which has a large social network, you are at a greater advantage. If you are in a community which has a small social network, then you don't get so many jobs through the network. And so you would expect that for boys in large communities, they would have greater incentives to go to the local language school as compared to boys in small communities. Okay. So what they find is that the gap in English education between girls of high and low castes disappeared. Okay, so essentially, most of the parents, irrespective of the size of the community, the caste, etc., sent their girls, their daughters, to the local language school. On the other hand, the gap for the boys remained intact. Okay, so the boys remained more or less in the local language schooling and kept using the traditional networks. Okay. Yes.
Low-tier white-collar jobs, you may rely on somebody telling you where to send your resume. So I
Okay, so the question that Ben is asking is, how specific is the labor market? How specific is this context in a sense? And you're very right. I mean, one can imagine, a variety of other empirical sort of, if you like, combinations. Okay, what's happening here is wages are higher in the white collar jobs, in the service sector jobs, but you can easily imagine service sector jobs that are very low paid, right? But that's not what is covered here in this study. Okay, so I take your point, but I'm just looking at a particular, very particular empirical study. Service sector here is essentially commercial jobs in firms that have opened up because of the liberalization of the economy.
But the claim is those are not being networked.
They are not networked. Yes.
And that claim is that a claim I think in detail in your work? Because it's sort of
Yes, it is. It is a claim that. Yes. So let me make a couple of remarks on the way I was not planning to get into more details of the paper. So. Yeah, so I was not going to spend a lot of time on that, and the model is written in a way which is very different, I think, from the way that I will try and explain, what's happening here. So, but what I want us to take away from this is the fact that people who are well connected in networks, when markets turn up, they would be more reluctant to join the market. So that's what you see here. Boys are more reluctant to join the market. Girls join the market. As a consequence of that, because wages are high in the service sector, gender inequality falls. Okay, so what you're seeing here is, going back to the motivation, you see when markets come in, so-called marginalized groups take advantage of the market, and they actually, therefore, lower inequality. So that's the takeaway. Okay, and so that's what I would like us to focus on, but happy to go into the paper offline. Okay. So here's another study, which is again a very specific empirical context, and this is taken from a paper by Jensen in the QJE in 2007. What the paper does is it looks at a very specific community of fishermen in South India. Again, it's in the 90s, and it's looking at a technological change. It's essentially looking at the spread of mobile telephony. Okay, so what's really going on is, maybe I should draw a picture to show you. So this is the southwest sort of boundary of India. This is the ocean. And what's happening is that you have villages scattered along the, along the shore, and people go out and they fish in the morning, early morning. And now, when they have caught the fish, they have to decide which market to go and sell the fish. Okay, and they want to go to a market where there's a coordination issue. They want to go to a market where there are a lot of buyers and very few sellers, because that will mean there's high prices. Notice that they have to sell whatever they can on early in the morning, and they can't take the fish and move to another market because of the perishability of the fish. Okay, so it's going to be very important to find the right market. Okay, so what was happening before mobile telephony was introduced was that if you look at a fish on a particular day, there was actually a lot of dispersion in prices across the different markets. Okay. And also there was a lot of waste, because you land up in a fish market in a town or a village where there are a lot of other people like yourself who are there. There are very few customers, so you have to throw the fish away. Now, what happens once the mobile telephone coverage expanded is that a lot of the fishermen bought mobile telephones. Okay. Once they bought mobile telephones, they actually had a pretty good idea what the state of these markets was, and they could pick the market that was, that basically needed their fish, and so they could go to the markets which had enough demand. So the result was that after a few years of the mobile telephony expansion, price dispersion fell very sharply, waste of fish fell very sharply, And overall, the profits of all fishermen went up, but the profits of the fishermen with large boats went up even more, and therefore inequality amongst the fishermen rose sharply. Okay, so this is quite in contrast to the earlier empirical study where gender inequality fell between the men and the women. Here you have a story where you have adoption more by large boats than the smaller boats, and the large boats also are, there's data in the, there's a lot of work on this empirical context over the years. These large boats are funded by more people, they have bigger social networks, and they are able to exploit those networks to sell at a better price. And so as a result, what you see here is an example of a market, a technological change, or a market coming into play. This is the mobile telephony, and it increases profits for everyone, so it increases welfare actually overall. Price dispersion falls, so there's greater efficiency, but inequality goes up. Okay. So, and because people are using these networks to find the right prices, the best markets, this technological change or this market reinforces and strengthens social networks. Okay, so we want to have a framework that allows us to be able to accommodate these two different, if you like, there will be other empirical applications later in the talk, allows us to bring these different examples into a common sort of framework. And so what I'll be doing is I'm going to set up a model where you will have social networks, people are embedded in these networks, markets arise, and now people have to decide whether they want to be in the market or only in the network or in both markets and networks. And so the first step will be to characterize behavior in this setting, and I will show that you can understand behavior in terms of the Q core of the network. And once you have this characterization, we can then start asking questions: who joins markets, who stays out of markets, what are the implications for welfare, what are the implications for inequality, and what are the economic mechanisms which lead to, which help us understand these two empirical contexts. Okay, so that's going to be the plan for the next half hour, 40 minutes. So I've already talked a bit about the literature, and let me make a couple of remarks. So the goal of the theoretical model is to try and reconcile these two views, okay, that markets are going to crowd out networks, or that markets will reinforce networks. That's going to be the overall goal of the theoretical model. So let me make a remark on how this model fits in with the literature, and let me say at the very outset that there is actually quite a large body of work which looks at markets and networks with using formal models. There's an early paper by Arnott and Stiglitz which looks at what happens to informal risk sharing in a community when you have formal insurance arriving. Okay. There is a paper by Andrea Gagliotti which looks at pricing by firms in social networked markets, and I just went through the Cranton paper. There's a very well-known early paper by James Montgomery on social networks and labor markets. Most of this work abstracts from network topology. By that I mean it abstracts from heterogeneities, if you like, in networks. And so what the work I'm going to present does is it takes the recent advances in games on networks, which are surveyed in these survey papers. This work by and large abstracts from markets. And so what we do is we bring insights from the games on networks literature to these questions about how markets and networks interact. So that's the goal of the paper. So this is more a bridge to, I think there will be, there's a lot of work on communities and development. Probably some of the best known work has been done by Munshi, one of my colleagues in Cambridge, and there's a very nice survey paper he has in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2014, which is, I think it gives a very good overview of how people in development have thought about how communities matter, how they are shaped by networks, how they distort the functioning of networks, markets. And the way that literature works is that it's very empirically oriented, and it looks at communities which are exogenously specified. So it could be caste in the Indian context, it could be ethnicity, black or white in the US, and so that's a given category, if you like, and it looks at variations in the size of the community, okay, to understand variety of empirical phenomena. So that's the sense in which networks matter in that literature. Okay. This is probably the most sophisticated literature, empirically the most sophisticated literature on networks or communities and development. So it's sort of worth bearing in mind that in this literature, for very good reasons, the focus is almost entirely on individual heterogeneity, but the network itself is a black box. Okay, it's just the size of the group that you're in. That's what network is in this community. Okay, in this research. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to introduce heterogeneity in connections. Okay, into that's the novel element. Now there are many empirical difficulties, about identifying network effects when these networks are heterogeneous, and I think Jan must have spoken a bit about identifying peer effects and network effects earlier on in the week. But at a high level, that's what is sort of different in this new networks and development work relative to the work that Munshi has surveyed in this paper. So that's sort of, I think it's worth bearing in mind. Okay, so the model is very, I'm going to take a model of networks, games played on networks, and then I'm going to introduce a market action where you won't have any network. Okay, so that's the flavor of the model. So you have players, you have a network which is an undirected graph or undirected network, and a player I chooses two actions, a network action X and a market action Y. And I'm going to define this piece of notation chi I. That's the number of people who are choosing the network action in your neighborhood. This is going to be a key piece of notation. Okay, so we're going to denote the payoff of player I in the network G with this action profile A. And this is how it's going to look like. Okay, so let me just walk you through this. So if you don't take part in the market and the network, well, you're inactive. So let's just normalize that payoff to 0. If you go to the market and you're not in the network, then the idea here is that the network is irrelevant. If the network is irrelevant, you have a standalone payoff from the market, and I'll denote that by pi y. Okay, remember y is the market action. The other two bits of this payoff are the interesting parts. Notice that if I'm only in the market, I'm only in the network, then I'm going to use this piece of notation phi 0, which is saying I'm not in the market. The 0 here refers to not being in the market. And so my payoff will now depend on how many of my neighbors are choosing the network action. On the other hand, I might be both in the network and the market, and in that case I have this bit of notation here phi 1 that refers to my being in the market. Okay, the 1 here refers to being in the market. And again, my payoff will be determined by how many of my neighbors are in the network who are choosing action X. Okay, so we're going to have this background assumption that if I want to be doing action, the network action, my payoffs are increasing in the number of neighbors who are doing the network action. Okay, this is simply complementarity in the network action. Okay. So the key, the second sort of feature of the payoffs is this assumption here. And what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to capture the idea that market activity can be complementary or it can be competing with network activity. Okay. And to formalize that, we define this bit of notation. And what is this saying? On the right hand side, what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to write down the marginal returns from going to the network, and I'm trying to compare two possible states where you are in the market and you're not in the market. Okay, so in the case of substitutes, when you are in the market, so it's easier to get the intuition for the complements case. In the complements case, what this is saying is that this function, is this epsi?
I think so.
Okay, so epsi is it's what's really going on is that if I'm in the market, the greater the marginal returns to my joining the network are larger. They're first of all positive, so it's better for me to join the network in the complements case, and they're increasing in the network connectivity. Okay, so that's sort of the key thing to bear in mind, that the more I'm connected, the more are my returns to joining the network when the market and the network are complements. Okay, and this is summarized in this assumption. So we are going to either work with the complements case or the substitutes case. Okay, so that's the simplifying assumption, but we are going to exploit substitutes and complements to explain the two case studies I went through. Yes?
Yeah, just to clarify the relationship with the research alliance model you had yesterday,
Sure.
which also has a network action and a market action. So what's the difference here is to adjust the relationship between market and network actions.
Okay, so the question here is, what's the relationship between this model and the models we did yesterday, where you had a network action, which was the research activity, and the market action, which is the quantity or the price, right? Okay, so it's a very good question, and I hadn't actually thought about, I don't have a very sort of quick sharp answer, but let's just think through it, right? So one of the things that clearly different here is that if you go back, a big difference is this feature here. So when I join the market, my payoff actually doesn't depend at all on how many people are in the market, what people are doing in the market. So I'm really a small player in this model. Okay, of course one can enrich this model and make my payoffs depend on market thickness. Okay, it's fairly easy to do that. But as things stand, this is the first order difference. Okay, in the earlier model, the heart of the story was that action in the market was, this oligopoly market. Right? So, okay. Okay, so let me, in the interest of time, let me give you one example of the kind of payoff function that would work. So here's a payoff function where you have a price for doing action X, you have a price for doing action Y, and here's the key sort of part of the payoff function which relates the two actions. So this is xi, this is yi, and notice that if theta is negative, then you have the substitutes case, and if theta is positive, then you have the complements case. So we are going to, because of the complementarity in the network action, typically there will be many equilibria in this model, and we want to not focus on that multiplicity in the paper. So to try and get that out of the way, we look at maximal equilibria. Those are equilibria which are basically Pareto undominated. Okay. And we define welfare simply as a sum of payoffs of all the players. So the first result is that this is, if you like, a background result. Once we have this result, we can move forward and do the analysis without worrying about multiplicity. It says that there exists an equilibrium, and the maximal equilibrium is generically unique. Okay. So in principle, this, if we had a more general model of many actions, continuous actions and so on, it would be, it would require probably a lot of argumentation to have established this sort of result. It would need probably stronger results. But in our setting with just two actions, a binary choice, x is either 0 or 1, y is 0 or 1. This is a fairly straightforward existence proof. Uniqueness needs a bit of work, but you can see that it's not that difficult to see that you will have uniqueness in this very simple setting. Okay, so with this background result in place, we can now start studying the questions we were interested in. How do markets and networks shape behavior? Okay, so the heart of this, the heart of the analysis here is going to revolve around the Q core. And here's a very simple intuition here. So if I'm going to choose between 1 and 0, I will choose 1 if chi is high enough. Remember that these actions are complementary, and so if I have enough connections, I will have more incentives to choose x. If I have no connections or none of them are doing x, then I don't have incentives to choose x. Okay, but for my neighbors to choose x, they must have enough neighbors choosing x, and so forth. Okay, so this is the idea. If you it's a recursive notion, and this is captured by the notion of the Q core. The Q core of this network G is the largest collection of players that have strictly more than Q links to other players in GQ. This set is unique, and naturally there's an inclusion relationship as you increase the Q. So let me try and give you some sense of how you work out the Q core. Okay, so you start with this network, and the first step is you take all the nodes out. I'm trying to work out the 4 core. So I take all the nodes out which have 4 or fewer connections. Okay, these are the nodes which have, so this one just has 4, and this one has 4 links. This is also 4, this has 3 links. So I take all of them out. So I'm left with this network, and now I iterate. So I take all the nodes out which have 4 or fewer connections, and so I'm left with this network. So this is the 4 core of that original network. Okay. So what's going to happen is that this Q core will be very helpful in understanding equilibrium behavior.
Sorry, so this iteration where you take out at every step guys with degree 4 or less?
Yes.
That will always get done. If you keep doing this and you stop, that will get done.
Yes. I mean, it could, of course, you could have a situation where there is, it's empty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. And it's unique. Okay. Okay. So now let's try and use that Q core idea to now understand behavior. So there are 4 actions. You're choosing between inactivity, 1 0, 0 1, and 1 1. And I'll focus in the talk on a simpler setting just to get the main ideas across. Let's try and understand how do you choose between doing the network action and doing the market action, or doing nothing. So I'm now comparing 0 0, 1 0, and 0 1. Okay. So what I need is, because of the assumption 1, there is some Q1 such that if chi I is greater than Q1, then it's better for me to be doing the network action on its own, okay, rather than going to the market or not doing anything at all. Similarly, I can define a number Q2 such that if chi I is larger than Q2, it's better for me to be doing market and network rather than doing neither or doing just the market. Okay, so we're going to use these 2 thresholds now to work out the Q cores. So here's the main theorem that characterizes behavior in. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a maximal equilibrium. We know it's generically unique. So what happens in this equilibrium? We find that if we look at the strong substitutes case, by strong substitutes I'm just referring to the situation where the payoffs are such that 1-1 doing both markets and networks is never optimal. Okay, this is just for simplicity. So in that case there are only three actions that could arise: 1-0, 0-0 and 0-1. And so what this first part of this theorem does is basically gives you conditions, a complete characterization of when you're going to choose which action. So if you are in the Q1 core, then you will choose just the network action. If you're outside the Q1 core, then you will be inactive if markets are unprofitable, and you will be just in the market alone if markets are profitable. Okay. Similarly, if you look at the complements case, so this is a situation where being in the network alone is ruled out by the strong complements assumption. You see that there is a Q2 core. Remember, Q2 is defined as the threshold for above which you want to do both networks and markets. So here we see that this is a necessary and sufficient condition for being in doing both. And if you are outside that, then you would do neither if markets are unprofitable, or you would do just the market. Okay, so how does it look like? So let me show you an example in the same network. So on the left I have the substitutes case, and on the right I have the complements case. So let's just walk through this slowly to understand what the theorem is really telling us. Okay, so these are the different types of nodes. So the empty blue node is inactive, the red cross is only active in the network, the blue dot here is active in the market, and the colored blue is active in both networks and markets. We are looking at the strong substitutes and strong complements case. So in the strong substitutes case, you are never active in both, so you don't have the dark blue here. So what we see here, if we stare at it for a few seconds, is that we have this Q1 core, and so this Q1 core is telling us who are the people who will do just the network action, and you can work out, given this theta, py and px, the value of the Q, and that's what we have done here. We basically worked out the Q core, and in fact I think this is a 4 core, and what's interesting to note here is that you have people who are actually in the Q core. Let's look for instance at Mr. 12 or at Mr. 10. They have fewer connections than people who are outside the Q core, like Mr. 9. Okay, Mr. 9 actually has many more connections than Mr. 10, but he's outside the Q core because his connections are with people who are not well connected themselves. Okay, so it matters not only how well connected you are, but whether your connections are well connected. Okay, that's sort of the idea the Q core captures. On the other hand, out here, so what are we taking away from this left hand picture? Well connected people stay in the network and don't join the market. On the right hand side you have the complement scenario, and there you see that the Q2 core are the people who are very well connected. They join both the network and the market. Okay, so you see the complements versus substitutes brings out this big distinction in behavior. In the substitutes case, it's the marginalized people who are outside the Q1 core who join the market. You see, these are the people who are outside the Q core. In the complements case, it's the people inside the Q core who are very well connected with other well connected people who join both the network and the market. So that's the big sort of distinction. So this is a step in the direction of trying to understand who's going to participate in markets and who's going to stay out of markets. And once we have that sorted, we can begin to ask questions about inequality. So here's another illustration of the theorem in the context of a regular graph and a co-periphery network. And since maybe I should move on, and I think these slides are available, so you can look at them at your leisure. Yes.
So you take a recursive 1 and 2, but in this example they coincide. Do you have a situation where you know why they differ?
Oh yes. So this is I don't think they coincide. Yeah, they may coincide. This is just because of the numbers we picked. There's nothing deeper than that. Yeah. Sure. Okay. So once we have that characterization, we can begin to understand.
There's another question.
Yeah. Hi.
So in the Q4 iteration depends on just the configuration of the network. But then in equilibrium, some of the well-connected people may choose to stay out of the, may join the market instead of stay out of the network. So those won't count anymore. And then the Q3 of the, some of the nodes will change.
Okay. So are you asking me about multiple equilibria, or are you? So what the maximal equilibria refinement, if you like, does is that it basically allows us to focus on the network on the one hand and the payoff function on the other hand. So those two things are going to define the Q core.
Yes, but I'm worried that when we talk about Q4, because they consider only the configuration of the network, like who you are connected to and who those you are connected to.
Right.
But then those people, some of them may not be in the networking yet, in the group. They may find it optimal to stay out of the network.
Yes. Sure.
So that
Sure.
should that not affect our decision to stay in or out?
Yes, yes, yes. So it's a very good point. Yes. So, okay. So let me try and rephrase what you're saying for the video. So, what you're saying is, supposing you have a world where you have a network and there is no market, then you might have some Q core and you might be doing network actions, but now the markets arise, and some people from the network might leave the network and join the market, and that will in turn mean that your chi-i might go down, which will mean that you may want to also withdraw from the network. Is that? Yes. So I think you're talking about the erosion of the network, if you like, and indeed this is going to be important when we start talking about participation, but also about welfare. Yes, you're very right, and this is exactly the way the market comes into the network in this model. Yes. Okay. So we want to understand what kinds of networks are receptive to markets. Are sparse networks more receptive to markets, or dense networks? In a given network, do well-connected people join markets or marginalized people? So we already know from the two empirical case studies that in the Bombay labor markets example, it's the marginalized girls who are joining the markets, and in the fishermen story, it's the well-connected larger boats that were joining, if you like, the market. Okay, so we already have some sense that you can have rather different empirical patterns. Okay. We know there is a unique maximal equilibrium, so let's define this market participation rate as simply the number of people who join the market as a ratio of the number of people in the economy. So here are some observations on what happens with regard to market participation. So the first observation is that market participation is weakly lower in denser markets in the case of substitutes. So in the case of substitutes, that markets get denser, networks get denser, they become more attractive, which means that markets become relatively less attractive, and so more people remain in the network, and therefore market participation falls. The converse happens in the case of complements. Notice that when there are complements, the returns to joining the network and joining the market go up in connectivity. That's assumption 2. In the case of substitutes, it's the people outside the relevant Q core who join markets. And in the case of complements, it's those who are inside the relevant Q2 core who are well connected who join markets. Okay, so you have sort of really one is almost a dual of the other. Okay, so and then finally you have market participation increases with the returns to market activity, which is fairly obvious. Okay, so this is going to go some way toward addressing the point you were raising about the erosion of the network. Okay, and it is also a big, it's a recurring theme in a lot of the work, for instance, on the moral economy, about what happens when markets come into traditional communities, what happens to welfare, and I'll talk a bit about inequality after this. Okay, so the first observation is that in the case of complements, the introduction of the market always raises welfare, while in the case of substitutes, it may lower welfare. So how does this work? So what's the intuition? In the case of complements, markets reinforce social ties. So whatever you are getting in your network activity, if you join the market, that goes up. Your marginal returns go up from the network activity, okay, by assumption 2. So you can only be better off if you know. What could happen in addition is that people who are outside the network activity, now when the markets arise, since the returns from both markets and networks have gone up, they take up both activities, which means that people who were earlier doing the network activity are now having more active neighbors, and so they're going to gain. And so everyone really gains weakly or strictly, and therefore it's quite unambiguous that you're going to have an increase in welfare. The case of substitutes is more interesting because really what's happening is that some people join the market. If they join the market, remember that the payoff from joining the market is a standalone pi y. If they leave the network, that must mean that whatever they were getting from the network was lower than pi y. Okay, so they are better off, okay, for sure. But people who are left behind in the network, if not everybody joins the market, they may have fewer neighbors who are in the network. Their network has become smaller, and so their payoffs have gone down. Now you can easily work out cases where the loss of the people left behind is larger than the gains of the people who have moved, and therefore you can have a fall in aggregate welfare. Yes?
Just in terms of interpretation, it doesn't seem like there's anything here that requires the network interaction to be sort of the same type as the market interaction. So it could be that in the market I'm buying goods and the network I'm information about jobs or something else.
Right. Yes. Yes. So yes. But the basic idea here, so this is very much also mentioned in the Munshi Rosenzweig paper, that as the family started sending their daughters to these English language schools, they started withdrawing from the social networks. And so in fact there were a lot of pressures on these people to withdraw their children from the English language schools because there was a clear perceived threat of the network dissolving. Yeah, so I think there is, yeah, I mean, so this erosion of the network, this comes through very nicely in the substitutes case. Okay. What is, I think, a little more novel relative to our, I think, intuitions and the existing literature is really the complements case, where the networks are actually strengthened, okay, by technology or markets. Yes.
Two-sided networks versus one-sided networks. So in the case of the fisherman, a fisherman always supply fish, but it's not a consumer, versus a case where we're trading assets, in which case, depending on the price, they become a buyer or a seller.
So the question here is whether we are working with undirected networks in this model. So there is some assumption that somehow we are both having some exchange. You are asking the question, what happens if you have directed networks? Would it have very different? So would it have very different implications for these kinds of questions? I have not thought about the directed networks case, partly because if you recall, assumption 1 is in the spirit of reciprocal exchange. So I do something for you and you do something for me. That's the way the model has been motivated and set up. But you're right. I mean, one could think of directed networks. I would have to think maybe of some other examples, applications. But sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth thinking about. I don't have anything concrete to say. Okay. Yes. Okay, so let me. I mean, I'm trying to understand what's the best way of relating these questions to the model, and I was going to talk about Facebook at length, actually. So, but through the lens of the model, so maybe I should postpone the discussion, and then maybe we can come back to your question. But I do have some slides on Facebook. Okay, so I'll talk about that. Okay. Okay. Are there any other comments or questions at this point? Okay, so we now move on to inequality, and so as many of you are aware, there's very, very many ways in which you can measure inequality. Okay, so when we started thinking about inequality, the first thing we did was to look at Gini coefficient, okay, which is probably the most widely used measure. And there are results on Gini coefficient in the paper, and so, but for the purposes of the talk, it's just easier to convey a lot of the intuition that we have developed so far using a much starker and simpler measure of inequality. So I'm going to talk about this measure, and for if you're interested, you're keen to know more about inequality, then we have results on Gini coefficient, which are very similar in spirit to what I'm going to present now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the ratio of the largest payoff in the maximal equilibrium relative to the lowest payoff in the maximal equilibrium. Okay. So that's the measure of inequality. Okay. How does this ratio move around? It's close in spirit to the range, it's close to some of the other ratio, like the 20-20 ratio, and so it's not, but it's been constructed because it's very tractable, gives us very clean results in the context of this model. Okay. So here's the result. Suppose, so in the setting we've been studying so far, in the case of substitutes, the introduction of the market decreases inequality, always. In the case of complements, it's just the converse. The introduction of the market will almost always increase inequality. Okay, so this bit when market participation is 100% is not probably the most interesting case. Okay, so if you set this aside, you see a very, very sharp and contrasting sort of implication of markets on inequality, depending on whether you have complements or substitutes. Okay. So the results for the Gini coefficient are not as crisp. Okay, there are some subcases, and but broadly, when we have sharp results for the Gini coefficient case, they are in this spirit. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about them, but let's try and develop some intuition for what's happening. So when X and Y are substitutes, when markets and networks are substitutes, what's really going on is the people who join the markets, this is very, very clear in the strong substitutes case. People who are going to join the market and quit the network are those for whom pi y, the market payoff, is larger than whatever they were getting in the network. Who are the people who are earning the least in the network? Those who have the least, who have the least connections with people who are active in the network. So they are the people who are earning the lowest payoffs. Okay, and so what happens is the denominator in this formula, okay, the denominator certainly weakly goes up when you have markets come in. But when people leave the network is eroded. People who stay back in the network weakly lose out. So the numerator weakly goes down. Okay, and therefore both these things go in the same direction, and so the result is unambiguous. You have a fall in inequality when you have markets that are substitutes to the network.
But you're assuming that the market offers the same opportunities to all individuals.
Okay, so very good question. Yes. So yes.
The market could by
Yes.
itself introduce inequality by giving
Yes.
different individuals different opportunities.
Yes. Okay. Very good point. So I was going to come to this later, but so one way of thinking about this could be that you have human capital, for instance, and if you have a lot of human capital, you are much better off in the market. That's that could be orthogonal to your network position. Yes. So I haven't talked about heterogeneities other than network heterogeneities, but they are going to be important. Okay, in this. Yes. So what I'm talking about here is a world where market access is essentially equal. And it's the network access, if you like, which is heterogeneous. That's the setting. Okay.
Yeah, but in real situations,
Yes.
do you think that
Okay. So now, if you have heterogeneity in human capital, okay, you can look at cases where that heterogeneity. So a simple case would be one where human capital is completely unrelated to network position. Another case could be one where it is actually positively correlated. Okay. So if you are having more human capital, you're also better connected. So very roughly speaking, the results we have are going to go through if the individual heterogeneity that you are interested in is positively correlated with network degrees. But it could be overturned otherwise. Okay, so that's the spirit of the results. So in the case of complements, you have really the converse sort of set of things going on. Okay. So because you have complementarity, the guy who's earning the most, so in other words, the person who has the most neighbors who are doing the network action, he is the person who's going to earn the most. Okay, his payoff from the network action, if he joins the market, will go up the most because of complementarity. So whereas the person who is very poorly connected, when he joins, either he stays out, okay, as in this example that we had, this picture, in this picture, it's the well-connected people who join the market and the poorly connected who stay out of the market. So their payoff actually doesn't change with the introduction of the market. The payoffs of the people in the market have gone up with the market coming in. Right, and so here you have a situation, the simplest case, where the numerator has gone up strictly and the denominator has remained unchanged, and therefore inequality has clearly gone up. Okay. But the proof is a little more involved, because what is likely to happen is that the min and the max both go up, so you need to look at the ratio, and it needs a bit of work, but that's the basic intuition. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit. I think a number of questions have come up about online social networks. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about online social networks, and also talk a bit about some open problems in this field. And so let me talk a bit about a number of points that were not sort of discussed, that were somehow ruled out by assumption or were buried under the sort of in the model. So one example that I want to talk about a bit is news exchange or communication and online networks and mass media. So the observation here is that, and this is it's not an empirical, I mean, it's sort of a very, I would say, anecdotal, but it's the point I'm trying to make here is that the dynamics between markets and social networks could exhibit non-linearities in the following sense. One, a technology might bring in a new product, a set of markets, which can lead to the decline of social networks, while a subsequent technology can lead to the revival and expansion of social networks. So this, let me now go back. So here's there's a bit of nice history here, that you have through the 20th century, you have mass media, which was organized in a certain way, but now we have online social networks, which are there are many things online social networks do. They are it's a very rich ecology, but let's look a little bit at Facebook. So there is a lot of work on Facebook in this, from different sources. There is some. So what I'm going to talk about is a report by Reuters, which looks at what people do on Facebook. And so one of the key developments over the last 10-15 years has been the decline in traditional media. Newspapers in many parts of the world are, it's not true in some parts of the world. So for instance, in India, newspapers have really grown over the last 10 years. But in the US, many newspapers have died. Very, very large number of newspapers have died, especially local newspapers. And so there are many reasons people have discussed why this is happening, but we know that at the same time there has been a tremendous expansion in the number of people using Facebook for news purposes. Okay, so this study shows that roughly half the people who are of the population of many countries is using Facebook for news purposes. And moreover, there is a lot of inequality in Facebook use, and so for instance, this report shows that roughly 40% of the younger age group finds news via online social networks, but only a very small fraction, 17%, finds this news when they are older. Okay. So, there's also work on how well informed people are, how rich are their sources of information, and they again, I have not come across a very nice sort of rigorous empirical study of information inequality, if you like, across groups. But what I want to talk about here is going back to the point that I think some people raised and Ben was raising. So the way I would think about this model, the way I would think about online social media or Facebook, looking through the lens of this model, is that you could buy a newspaper, you could go to the shop, you can get a newspaper, you pay a price, and that doesn't really depend on who else is reading the newspapers. Whereas I think what you can get out of Facebook depends very much on how connected you are locally. You have to be connected. You should have friends who are active, and your returns are larger the more active your friends are. You have many friends and they are active, and so that's the sense in which I think it's natural to think about the social network being strengthened. Ties which would be latent have become active because basically you can keep connectivity through the technology. That's the way I was thinking about it. But do you want to speak to this?
Well, actually, it seems to me, I mean, that's another way to produce the model. I guess it seems to me that what's critical about the technical results is that this new, whatever it is that's the new activity, doesn't depend on ties in the old network. So the old network could, like in the bowling globe story, the old network could be like people on my blog who I can go to barbecues with, and the new network is friends from college that I can talk to on Facebook. And I think you could prove the same
Right.
results that the local physical network gets thinned out because of access to this new network. And I didn't have to say the word marketing, but I think the forces that would thin out the physical network would be the same as in your main story about the movie.
I see, yes. So I think you're making a slightly more nuanced point that I think within the world of networks, you can have different sorts of networks, and these technologies could be facilitating certain networks and at the cost of other networks. Yeah.
So I think the formal stuff you've done very easily extends to some of that sort. Maybe I'm
Okay. Okay. So yes.
Actually, you can get the kind of externality that you were talking about also within a given network by, for example, assuming that people can connect only to a limited number of other people. Then I might want to,
Oh, okay.
I think this comes even in the basic work of Matt and Asha Walensky. This externality that, if I can connect only to a limited number of people because, say, of time constraints,
Mm-hmm.
then I might not connect to someone and choose to connect to another one and impose a serious externality on the person I'm disconnecting from.
Yes. So that's a good point. So I think one way of thinking about what Ben was saying is to introduce some constraints.
Constraints.
Yeah, and then
Well, once you introduce constraints, getting within a network,
Yes.
you don't have to speak about different networks.
sure. So I thought I made. Okay, so I'm going to come to that maybe after this. So yeah, so I think this is related to this point here. I've already responded. I think there was another question, right? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, but in this, the markets aren't complementary. I don't care who else is playing the market, right? In the model that's set up now.
That's right. So far,
So
yes,
to have
yes.
the market be another network, you might want to have a complementing that action.
Right. So the question here is the market. So this is really the market thickness sort of things. But in addition, you can also have a network you can have competing networks. Yeah. So as things stand, participation in the market is anonymous. Okay, that's sort of literally it's anonymous. It doesn't matter. Of course, one can make it richer by having the market size mattering, and there are some results in the paper on that. But we haven't thought of a second network. Okay, but I think it's a natural thing to be thinking about. Yes. So number of remarks. So we've already talked about some of these. Let me just say that in the model, I only benefit from the actions of my immediate neighbors. If I were to benefit from the actions of all my neighbors and the neighbors of my neighbors and so forth, then of course we will come very close to the group size model. Then all that I care about is the size of my component. Okay, if indirect benefits are smooth and frictionless, and that will bring us very close to the traditional models and the empirical work that I talked about in development, the work, for instance, of Munshi and Rosenzweig and others. Okay. Elchanan and others have sort of raised the issue, these networks might evolve. Notice that in the framework I have, although I have been somewhat loosely referring to market networks getting eroded, there is no network formation. Okay, so this idea that there is a constraint and you can only do so much in a day, you want to have networks evolving as markets come up. And indeed, there's a lot of empirical work now which looks at how networks evolve. Some links are formed, others are dissolved. And I think that's a very nice, natural question to look at. And the welfare implications of that. And I think it's a very It's obviously very important. So let me make a few remarks on the. I have about 5 minutes, so let me make a few remarks on the last bullet point here. So, market in the many ways in which I'm taking a very reduced form view of markets in this paper. One is that, but there is a, if you step out of the model, there's a much larger sense that you would think that how well the markets work are going to depend on institutions, and indeed you want to bring social networks into play because there's a lot of interest in trying to understand how governments work well or they don't work depending on social networks. So this is a little sort of related to the work, for instance, that the comments that Ben was making. There's this very well-known work of Robert Putnam on, it's controversial, but the big point in that work on Italy is that northern Italy works a lot better compared to southern Italy, even though they have the same constitutional arrangements, because there is, quote unquote, there's a lot more social capital. There's a lot better social networks in the north compared to the south. So that's in our language, that's an argument that social networks and the engagements of civic engagement in northern Italy act like complements to the functioning of governments. They improve the performance of governments because somehow you need social networks to get governments to work properly. So this is, of course, also in the spirit of Bowling Alone and other other pieces of work that Putnam has done over the years. So one of the things that we think that it would be very important to begin to think about is to bring markets and social networks and institutions, actually more generally, together, because they have a bearing on how markets work, and of course they have a bearing on how the state works or does not work. So let me just summarize. So what we have done is, I think, bring this games on networks literature, which is very alive, and there's a lot of interesting insights, into a more applied space where you have markets and networks, and we've tried to engage with sort of sort of questions about how markets and networks interact in terms of participation, inequality, and welfare, using the ideas that we've developed from the networks literature, using concepts and ways of thinking, some ideas, concepts from game theory, complement substitutes, and building on those, we are able to address questions about inequality and welfare. So this slide sort of summarizes some of that in slightly more general language. Okay. So there's a set of references which cover most of the material I've talked about today. I think this is a fascinating field and very open. So I think the relationship between social networks and the state, and how social networks, online social media, are affecting the way the state functions, how policy making is being affected. These are very first order sort of questions. They are very much being studied by political scientists, and I think economists, I think with all the tools we have now, I think we should also try and address some of those questions. I think it's a very open set of issues. But are there any questions?
Yes. So there are two groups of writers you haven't mentioned. I was wondering, one, there's some studies by a group of anthropologists, I guess, and economists, Sam Bowles, Boyd,
Yes.
look at economists at all levels. Sorry about that.
Yes. Yes.
And there are, and then they measure social networks, I guess, by
Yeah.
how they play these trust games.
Yes, yes.
The goods and the very goods. And they seem to find a positive correlation between trust, as measured by how people play games, how much they give to people, and marketization.
Yes, yes.
The other one is the Asimongo and Robinson.
Yeah, so let me make, so Ken was mentioning this work on experiments across different parts of the world in small communities. This is a very well-known book, The Foundations of Human Sociality. It's a, I should have mentioned that. Yes, I don't have anything very much to say on the relationship between that work and our model. But you're very right that is, I would say, it's a very important, contribution in that literature. So I think one way of thinking about how one might think about some of those things related to this model at a high level, I would say that there is a point some people have made that the models we are writing down are under-socialized. And I don't know if that's one way of thinking about why is it that the model that I have just developed doesn't really get to the kinds of questions that, for instance, the Boyd, Richardson, Bowles, Gintis, that sort of work, how trust evolves with greater market. So, for instance, your own work on limits of organization, on the role of trust. So there may be a sense that we need richer models of human behavior along with networks. This is very much there's a lot of, I think the social networks take a lot of the space in these models. And I think so there's a sense in which, maybe we want to think a little deeper, I think, about those sorts of anthropological works. The work of Acemoglu and Robinson, I know that they have more recently been doing work on social capital and institutions, and I'm also aware there's some recent work that Matt Jackson has with Daron, relating somehow broadly on this issue of law enforcement and norms and networks. But I still feel that this is very much an open field. I think that the thrust of that work, I think, really leaves out social networks, the Acemoglu-Robinson work, and most of the work. So I would say that this is still very much open, sort of.
But it's this idea that if we're working with markets,
Yes.
depends on, in markets, you have very remote relations, and somehow, so you might say that undermines social networks. I don't really know. In a market system, I'm depending on distant people whose existence I'm not even aware of.
Yes.
That's the idea of the market system is action at great distance, where you only have to know your immediate market.
Yes.
You're operating.
Yes.
In practice, making that money. But and so one point of view is that increases the value of networks. There's this trade, for example, there's this literature on trade between North Africa and Italy
Yes.
in
Yes.
the Middle Ages.
Yes.
And one of the questions is how do you enforce contact? There was a law, after the initial spread of land was cut, greatly reduced Mediterranean trade, but it was particularly violent.
Mm-hmm.
And it was. But one of the questions was, how do you enforce, how do you get paid? How do you enforce contracts? And in some areas, it depends on social pressure.
Yes. Yes.
In others, they have courts.
Yes. Yes.
Generally, when they have courts, it's just and putting much more on social pressure.
Yes. So
One of the arguments of capitalism needed, or even trade in the North, where there were very elaborate commercial regulations for the great fairs. So that you needed state
to get yes.
in order for capitalism to survive.
Yes.
That seems to fit in very much.
Yeah, so I think there's my own sense would be there'd be a lot of very interesting possibilities for building on the work that the social networks researchers come up in the last 15 years, to take some of the insights from that to address those kinds of, because the earlier literature has been either abstracting from network structure or taking very simple networks. So somehow I think it raises the question, these first order questions, does network structure have something first order to contribute to these questions?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.